edition of our Abhorrent Community. Welcome our guest, Jane Thomson.
Hello, it's lovely to be here, Chris.
Jane, it's a tradition here on a podcast to always ask people their story, whether they were born and bred here or whether they came from somewhere else. What's your origin story?
Well, if I've just met you at something, these days I like to say that before Farmer Wants a Wife was a television show, that was me. I was a hapless corporate girl in Sydney who happened to meet a charming young farmer 21 years ago who brought her back to his family farm. And so I've been up here all that time.
And where do you live out in the hills in the Northern Rivers? Where do you actually live now?
Yes, I live in Eltham, so famous for the pub these days.
Yeah.
And people who have been to the Eltham pub are often quite blown away by the fact that there is no town of Eltham. It is just a pub and a tennis court and then the farms that surround it. So I'm one of those farms.
Go back to the city life. Where did you grow up in Sydney or Melbourne?
Yes, I grew up in Sydney, eastern suburbs, and I actually started off as a psychologist as my first career, specialising in organisational psychology and in particular the dynamic or the relationship between language and behaviour. And I really loved it. I really still have a huge passion for the way that language influences behaviour and vice versa. But I absolutely hated working in the corporate world. So I was very happy to find my farmer and change lives 21 years ago.
In just going back to that, I'm also interested, I'm guessing when you speak of language, you talk about how language within organisations impacts things like culture.
That was what I was doing professionally, but I mean, I wasn't expecting to do that necessarily when I was moving through my degree. It kind of ended up that way. I've always had a real passion for language, and it was really, I guess, an accidental career that I ended up in organisational psychology as opposed to doing something like journalism or English, which was what I thought I was heading towards when choosing my high school subjects all those very many years ago. But I'm really glad that my first career was in psychology because it is such a useful tool for everything in life. And so no matter what I'm doing, whether it's been parenting, starting a new life on a farm, or doing my current career, which is working in the wine industry, there's always stuff that I'm drawing on from that first experience, understanding the relationship between language and behaviour.
One of the last recent guests we had, Andy Hamilton, was on, and Andy's from Melbourne, and Andy started and still runs Human Nature, an amazing organisation that looks after the mental health and helps young people in their teens. And he did psychology and politics. And I'm going to ask you, why does psychology, and I noted then in your answer you said it helps you with your family and it helps you moving to a new area.
Yeah.
How does it work when you study that you then use that in your family or in moving to a new area I'm particularly interested in? How does it work there?
I think just having an understanding that, in particular for me, that a behaviour is not necessarily correlated to a value or a core belief or even an emotion at that time. And so people might say something or behave in a certain way, but that's often very misleading from what they're actually thinking or feeling at the time. And yet every day in all of our lives, we pretty much interpret behaviour as what someone is thinking or feeling. But I think the biggest lesson I got from psychology is that so often it's actually the opposite. And so the way that we interpret each other in the world and the way that we give meaning to each other's behaviour each and every day is so often wrong that it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that we are sort of bumping up against each other so often in our everyday relationships, in our corporate relationships, in our family relationships, even just watching and hearing and seeing things in our daily news cycle and the interpretations that are put on people's behaviours, I find quite fascinating because when you understand the science behind that and the psychology behind that, there's no need or there's a falsehood, I guess, in putting meaning on someone's behaviour. It doesn't necessarily correlate to what they are actually thinking or feeling.
We get it wrong so often, so is in part the way to get it right more often to teach psychology as we do maths and English from the get-go. Is that the answer?
That is such a good question. I would say yes. I think that often psychology or emotional intelligence is viewed as a soft skill. I think it's hardcore. I think that, and you look at corporations or businesses today being really interested, Chris, in emotional intelligence as well as, intellectual capability. And I think that it's been shown time and time again that the people who have the higher levels of emotional intelligence often do better in every aspect of their life. So I think, yes, I'm a supporter of that.
I've had debates with people over the years about whether you can teach EQ or not. Do you think you can teach emotional intelligence?
I think you absolutely can, because it's a skill. So I think that certainly some of that is innate. So your ability to view and understand somebody's point of view or feeling or current emotional state, some of that is innate, but it can absolutely be learned. And you can see that when you are dealing with people for whom emotional intelligence they often struggle with. So that have diagnosed intellectual disabilities or social disabilities or somewhere on the autism spectrum. Often those people are actually given training in helping to understand and interpret emotions and behaviour.
What's the hardest part about moving from the eastern suburbs of Sydney to Eltham?
Well, I'll tell you what it was 21 years ago, was that I was living in Enmore, just near Newtown, and I was very used to every day walking up the road to get my fresh loaf of sourdough bread.
Yeah.
And 21 years ago, here in the Northern Rivers, you could not buy a single loaf of sourdough bread.
You couldn't.
So I had a small baby at the time, so I used to fly home to Sydney quite regularly with the baby to see my friends and family, and I would take an empty suitcase with me and fill it up with sourdough bread and bring it back and pop it all in the freezer. So you can hardly imagine, that it was like that only 20 years ago up here, but it certainly was. So that was the biggest challenge to start with.
Yeah.
I think over the course of 2 decades, what surprises some people who don't live in this area when I talk to them about living in the Northern Rivers is how hard it has been to make friends who stay here.
Yeah.
So over the 2 decades, I've had lots of great friendships, but so often they have come and moved away again. And so I've only got a very small pool of people for whom I've known for that entire period who still live in the region. So I found that really challenging, having to constantly make and form and support and sustain new friendships as people move in and out of the area.
Making friends and keeping friends is a skill, and because our area does have lots of people coming and going, and I've helped many of them come here and some go. What have you got to do and I'll background this by saying a lot of people listen to the podcast live in Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra and live overseas. So our audience, we saw a map the other day of who listens to this podcast, but a lot of people listen to it want to move here.
Yep.
Right? So when you move here and living here, what is some of the most important things you can do to build a friendship group when you move to a new area like this?
That's a great question. I don't know if, even with my psychology background, I'm qualified enough to answer it.
Yeah, you are. I'm experienced.
I know that for me, the timing was good because kids are a great gateway to networks of people. And so we moved when my youngest was only 8 months old, and we've had 2 others since we were here. So straight away, you've got a common interest, common needs. Yeah. So meeting, other parents at the school gate or the preschool gate, as it was, and down at our local Eltham pub as well was a great gathering spot when we first moved here. So a lot of those friendships formed in those early years through the kids are still the ones that we really value and cherish and nurture. And we've been really sad to say goodbye to a lot of them, but we still have a few that sort of stay in the area. What I found is that as the kids do grow, and often in this area move away to start uni in another city or to train somewhere in another city, that's when often people do leave the area as well, or downsize from a big farm out at Eltham to something sort of more on the coast here. So, I think having a common link, whether it's through kids or your dog at the park or, joining one of the many, many groups that do exist in the area. I think it's easier now, Chris, than it would have been, 20-something years ago, because you have, again, it's hard to think there was no sourdough bread. There was hardly any internet connection either. Yeah. So now you've got all these great groups that you can find online and then meet up in real life. I think there's no replacing the in real life connection at any stage of life. Yeah.
Eltham's a rural area, and for people listening to this, it's a beautiful area. It's about 30 minutes from where we're sitting here. from Enmore to Eltham,
Yep.
are you on some land out there?
Yes, 100 acres,
All right.
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the difference. Like, for want of a better word, 100 acres is an awful lot of inner city blocks of land. It's hundreds and hundreds of blocks.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about living on 100 acres as opposed to living in Enmore.
Apart from walking out your door and being able to get everything you want,
Yeah,
yes, it's still a
apart from
challenge.
that, yeah.
So I think one of the biggest challenges for me has been the isolation, because I'm a real people person. So even though we are not by any standard living in a remote location, just the accidental people contact that you get living a city life, like walking out your door and having 2 or 3 neighbours that you might walk past, or grabbing your coffee first thing on your way to something. You just don't have that living on 100 acres surrounded by other 100-acre properties. So I have to, and I work for myself, so I have to plan social interactions into my day. Otherwise, especially now that my kids are mostly grown, you can go for days without seeing another adult if you don't need to. So that's the sort of stuff that I took completely for granted coming from the city. And the other adjustment, I think, for me has been the impact of weather on your everyday life. So our farm has, like so many up here, been devastated by floods over the last few years. We were pecan growers, quite successful pecan growers, and we haven't had a crop for the last 3 years, not necessarily due to the water on the ground, but due to the water from the sky being so constant for that period. And so, I think growing up in the city, I would watch on the news about the plight of farmers and people growing our food, but being one is something completely different, and understanding that you are at the mercy of the weather, and you are actually not at, you don't get a lot of empathy from people who don't live on the land. They just continue to expect you to pump out that food or keep doing your thing. And I think it's one of those experiences where unless you've done it, it's very hard to empathise with those who are doing it.
We had Frank Boyle on here, the pecan farmer, early in the piece, maybe 18 months ago. And he took us through the trials and tribulations of the weather and the impact. And I know Frank quite well, and the rain has very much impacted his working life. He's got rice as well. Do you think that they talk about the city-country divide, but people in the city, it's not their fault, and it's not the people in the country's fault, but because the city people don't get a chance to go out and visit and spend some time in the country areas, I don't think they completely understand the force that the weather or bad weather can have and how it imperils all of us. And the lack of empathy, communications is what you do. What would you do if you were given a project like letting people in the city understand more about the lives of farmers? What would you do?
Well, I think that most people's interactions with country life are bucolic rather than real.
Yeah.
And so we're probably, encouraging rural tourism and rural farm experiences that tell the wrong story. They tell the happy, amazing, incredible life story, not the real one. So, it's interesting looking at the data of all the people who've tried to undergo a tree change, particularly since the COVID era, and how so many of them have uprooted and moved back again because they were so unprepared.
Yeah.
So I think that, I don't know where the balance lies there, but I think, you don't want to invite someone out and give them a terrible time on your farm, do you? But at the same time, perhaps, again, you alluded to earlier about including psychology in schools. It'd probably be a great thing to consider at that school level, having school kids, giving them exposure to what it's like to live a rural life and to be so dependent on the weather and the climate. Some of those very wealthy private schools in Sydney, I know, give their boys at least 3 to 6 months out in the wilderness, trying to toughen them up a bit and make them realise they're not so spoiled and elite. Perhaps there's a case to be made where we could, give kids an extended stay on rural properties as part of their upbringing so they could see the realities of what it's like.
Yeah, and they take a lot of the kids nowadays from the different schools they're at, go to overseas and visit other cultures where it makes you think that it would be just as valuable, if not more so, to visit some of the farms in the region here. I found you as an individual through one of my partners, Helen Huntley Barrett, who did one of your wine tours. I could talk about these other issues we've raised so far,
Yep.
but I want to get to wine because
Great.
you've got an Order of Australia and you've done some amazing things in the area of wine. Tell us a little bit about wine in general and the importance of wine. I looked up some things yesterday and I was stunned.
Okay, like what?
Well, I looked up yesterday
Yep.
the value of wine. I looked up things like where Australia sits. We're one of the biggest exporters of wine, all of those things. But like we were talking about a minute ago, I don't think the public in general understands. So tell us a little bit about the importance of wine and the wine industry.
As an economic benefit?
Yes.
Yeah. So to Australia, it is a huge economic benefit. But I think what you said a moment ago about people not understanding it is also true. And people don't, I think unless you have had some exposure to the wine industry, you don't realise how economically significant it is, how it is an agricultural product. So going back to talking about farm life and what it's like to be at the mercy of the land, it's an agricultural product. It's not like making gin, for example, where you just buy in the alcohol, throw in some botanicals and off you go. You know, you really are, these growers are at the mercy just like other farmers, but we treat them or think about them very differently. I don't think we should. I think that the wine industry is an agricultural industry and we have to keep thinking about it like that.
You think that, Jane, is because some people look at wine as
bougie?
You've said it, not me, but yeah.
I think it's misunderstood, and I think that is often the fault of the wine industry itself. So to get slightly controversial and slightly sort of gender lensed for a moment, it has been very much the domain of sort of white middle-aged men in cardigans for a long time. Yeah. And I think that they have dominated...
Cardigans have got such a bad name,
haven't they just?
Yeah.
But I think that the problem is in any industry where you have a lack of diversity around the narrative about that industry is that you just get that very linear view of something. So we've just had the voices of that particular type of person are dominating the Australian, not just Australian, but particularly the Australian wine industry for pretty much the entirety of its life. And so when that's the case, you don't have a bunch of diverse voices, you're not getting a bunch of diverse messages out there. It becomes almost cult-like, or there's like a protectionist or a protectionism around the secrets of what the wine industry is like. And I think that that's done a huge disservice to the wine industry. I think that what we're seeing now in the last decade is thanks to, thanks not to social media, you're actually starting to have an emergence of some diversity in the voices that are talking about, promoting, and I guess getting people excited about wine. And so you're able to cut through some of that secret cult-like status that wine has and make people feel more comfortable. Certainly in Australia as a country, we've ridden the food journey over the last 20 years. You know, I keep coming back to sourdough, but just the journey of this region has been extraordinary over the last 20 years in terms of us understanding the importance of food, how it connects us to not only the land but to each other, how it's so essential for our health and our well-being. And I think that in other wine producing or old world wine producing nations, the food and wine story have gone hand in hand. So there's a greater knowledge, acceptance and understanding of wine in those cultures. Whereas for Australia, the wine industry and the food industry have almost operated very separately. And so you don't get that very hand in hand interlocked education and knowledge as you're growing up in Australia the way they do in France or Spain or Italy or some of those older world nations. So it's now a case of us having to educate our food lovers in a way that they don't have to do in those old world nations because it happens just as part of their everyday growing up. And so I think in Australia and some of the other new world wine nations like the US and New Zealand, we are needing to break this very cult-like status around wine and open it up and show that it is for everyone and that it is an agricultural product and that it is grown and produced by real people working the land and that it is, just like great food, something that connects us, joins us together and creates really social cohesion when it is enjoyed in moderation. And just like, everything in moderation, including moderation, Chris. So
I saw a quote, I think it might have been on your website, but it talked about the need, and when we're talking diversity, we're talking more women to be involved in leadership positions in general in the wine industry. And I saw a quote, correct me if I got it right, you can't be what you can't see. And I wondered where and how, two questions. How did you get into wine in the first place? And then when did you decide that you would do something about the lack of diversity?
Sure. So moving up to this region all those years ago, I couldn't continue to be an organisational psychologist because there weren't any organisations big enough to do that here. And I was starting a family, and so I actually moved more purely into communications and did a lot of freelance communications in the region, but had grown up in and around wine in a funny sort of way. So my father was a very enthusiastic wine drinker and consumer, and so we were one of those rare families in the 70s and 80s that had dinner on our dining room table every night with dinner. So wine on our dining room table every night with dinner, and that made us odd, different. You know, that wasn't happening on my friends' tables. And then my dad ended up actually becoming a grower and producer himself in the Hunter Valley. So that was sort of always around me. And then after working in freelance comms here in the region for a few years, I kind of became that girlfriend in my circle of friends who always wanted everyone to come over and try some wines or have a dinner and, you know, order some wines we could try together. And I was always explaining, you know, the region, the producer, that sort of thing. And I went through a very difficult loss in that my brother passed away quite suddenly when he was just 30, and he didn't have any next of kin or any kids, and he had a very small superannuation amount which had to be sort of given away. And so I inherited just about $10,000 at the time, which we could have, as young parents, put on our mortgage or helped to pay off our car. But instead, I listened to a girlfriend of mine who was at one of these wine dinner parties I was holding, who said in response to me saying, "Oh, I'm so sick of doing comms. I really wish I could do something, you know, more land related or farm related or even wine related." And she said, "Jane, you should do this. You should do exactly this. You are so great at breaking down these myths around wine, explaining them to us, getting us excited and enthused about the wine on our table the way that, you know, I'm excited about bringing you something where I found at the farmer's market. You've got that same thing with wine. You should do this." So like so many things in life, I took that small financial opportunity that came and thought I would start something with that, thinking that it might just be a bit of a side hustle for a while. What I did was think that there needed to be an online platform that focused on women to help debunk some of these wine myths, make wine an accessible thing. And I thought it would be an online business that I ran, but that lasted for about 3 months because straight away, Chris, there was a huge lot of interest with people online signing up and wanting to become a member of what I called the Fabulous Ladies Wine Society. But what they very quickly told me was, well, when are we getting together? When are we having these in real life wine tastings? When can we come to something where we can try some wine?
How long ago was this?
That was in 2012.
Yeah.
So within 12 months, it actually became an events and experiences company, and I haven't looked back. And what I found quite quickly was that it was not just about providing wine tasting and wine experiences in real life for female consumers. It was also about supporting the women in the industry, because I found out quite quickly that the representation of women in the Australian wine industry was woeful. And coming out of psychology and then a communications career, I even found the communications, the industry communications around wine to be completely unacceptable in other industries. The way that
blokey or two,
very blokey, and just you know, you would pick up a copy of the latest industry magazine and it would be cover to cover pictures of men in, you know, making wine, growing wine, producing wine. There was no diversity. It was all about their stories. Where were the stories of the women in the industry? And I think it comes back to what you said a moment ago. You can't be what you can't see. If you're not seeing pictures of female wine producers, winemakers, and all the other roles that go into making a bottle of wine, you're not even having that on your subliminal subconscious radar that that's something that you can do in life. And so straight away, within the first 12 months, I dedicated my business to only showcasing and supporting female producers. And that's been probably the most exciting part of what I've done.
I'm going to guess once you started doing that, there would have been some upsides and a few downsides.
Yes.
I got this vision of the blokes in the cardigans, maybe not always been, but I'll come back to them in a minute.
Sure.
Share with us some of the enjoyable bits of working with women who were over in the corner, in the dark corner, and not have any lights on them. Share with us some of the stories around that and the upside.
Sure. Well, one of my favourite experiences early on was that I was contacted by industry luminary name DeBortley, right? Very early on in my first year or two of business, DeBortley reached out. And I got to work with Leanne DeBortley, you know. So, again, an industry luminary from an industry recognised name internationally.
Down in Griffith, or not Griffith.
They started out, in the Riverlands
did.
out there. Leanne and her husband Steve have DeBortley Yarra Valley, so they have that, making some amazing prestige wines from that region. So that's the sort of wines I was working with her, those Yarra Valley wines. Anyway, what was fantastically... what's the right word here? Joyous or validating for me was that the very first wine dinner I ran with Leanne DeBortley, she was nervous. And I couldn't understand why, because she's an amazing woman, you know, incredible pedigree and so chatty and warm and wonderful. And she was nervous. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this. She probably... and I actually found that really endearing, and I wanted to know, you know, why. And it had turned out... she had never hosted her own wine dinner before. That had always been Steve's job. And so it was so thrilling to be able to give somebody like Leanne DeBortley the platform to comfortably stand up and run her first wine dinner. I know she's done many since, but that has really stuck with me. And having that as an experience in my very early days really helped me to go, what I'm doing here is a good and valuable thing. And if somebody like that, with that sort of pedigree and talent and ability to connect with people, hadn't been given that opportunity before, then how wonderful that I was able to do that. And it really made me double down on it.
I've had the great honour and pleasure of interviewing lots of people over the last few decades and some of the most famous literary figures in the world. And I can tell everyone listening to this, some of the most nervous people I've ever interviewed are the most famous literary figures in the world.
Wow.
I think everyone thinks fear goes away when you're famous, and it so doesn't. Let's just go back to something else you said that I'm really interested in. What are some of the common myths that are attached to the wine industry that you debunk?
Common myths? Oh, that you have to know a whole bunch of stuff. That's the number one thing. People think they can't enjoy a wine because you have to know a whole bunch of stuff first before you're able to say whether you like it or you don't like it, right? Because God forbid you might not like it, and then what if you're supposed to like it? You know, that's terrifying. But I often use the analogy of art to describe what it's like to enjoy wine. So none of us seem to think that we need to understand art too well in order to be able to give our opinion as to whether we like or don't like a piece. But what does help is, in the art world, knowing about the artist, knowing about the medium, knowing more about that art and what we like and don't like about it helps us to understand it and gives us the confidence to then describe what it is we like or don't like about it to our friend or our colleague or so forth. And wine's exactly the same. You don't have to know a lot about it to know whether you like it or don't like it. But if you also happen to get interested and learn about who's making it, where it comes from, what varietal or varietals it's made of, then you'll start to understand more about what you like and don't like, so you can make more confident choices, and you can describe to your friends and colleagues or whatever what you want to drink when they ask you, rather than just saying, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. I don't know, do I like Chardonnay? I don't know. And I think the other thing is, here in Australia, we get very caught up on varietals. So all of our bottle shops are organised according to varietals. We'll order a wine, we'll say, I'll have the Pinot Grigio, or I'll have the Shiraz. Whereas, in the old world wine growing nations, it's actually the region it comes from that's far more important than the variety it's made from, because the impact of the soil, the climate, the weather, and the wine producer has a much bigger impact on the flavour and the style of that wine than even the variety can. And so people are often sort of shocked when they hear that for the first time. They think, well, I don't like Chardonnay, but yes, you do if it comes from that region and if it's made in that way and if it's this particular sort of producer who's making it and using these techniques.
Yeah.
Guess what? That's when you'll like Chardonnay. So it's not really about the varietal. It's about all of those things coming together. So I think those two things are the main myths that I like to debunk. First, that you have to know a whole bunch of stuff before you can say whether you like or you don't like it. And secondly, that variety is not the end of the decision making.
Old world, new world. We're in the new world.
Yep.
Tell us both ways in the wine world. What are some of the things we could be doing that the old world does?
Yep.
And there's that Tucci program on SBS about Italy. There's two series.
It's fantastic. Yes, it's a brilliant series.
But and it's funny that I just dropped down into my head then when he goes and visits wineries and restaurants in all the different regions of Italy, and there's female winemakers. The different generations feature in a lot of the different programs. It appears to me over there that there's no male-female divide in the old world, or is there? Do they do a better job of that than we do here?
They don't. They don't.
Okay.
What I imagine is happening in the Tucci program is that they've probably got gender ratios they have to meet for the production company.
Okay.
However, there is a caveat on that. So in Italy, they are the best organised in terms of their women in wine advocacy. So they have one of the most well-funded, well-established and well-organised women in wine groups throughout the world.
Really?
And yeah, absolutely. And so because of that, they might have even put those sorts of gender balanced things, on anything that's being filmed in wine. Who knows? But it wouldn't surprise me if they'd had their tentacles in that decision.
Yeah.
They are very well organised. The stats are not too dissimilar around the world, old world versus new world. That's just, wine speak for countries who've been growing it for a really long time versus countries that haven't. In the countries that have been growing it for a really long time, there's really no difference in the gender divide compared to the ones who are newer at it like us. In fact, in some of those countries, particularly places like Portugal and Malta and Greece, it's worse because you've got all of that intergenerational patriarchy where, our wineries get handed down to the oldest sons traditionally. Mm. So it can often be worse in those old world wine countries. In places where wine is very new, so for example, in Central Otago, New Zealand, it's only really been a wine region for about 30 or 40 years. And similarly in Tasmania, when you don't have that long history of patriarchy in the region, you actually get higher gender ratios. So in Central Otago and in Tassie, they've got some of the best gender ratios in the wine world anywhere. And one of the theories is because they're both very new regions that haven't had to deal with all of that history.
You mentioned that you set up originally just over a decade ago, thinking you were going to be working on some form of digital platform and everyone wanted to meet. I'm very interested in when you bring people together, what do you actually do? Yep. And what surprised you about those meetings?
Sure. So we run wine experiences. And so they are either wine dinners or wine tours. So in the wine dinners, they are the more regular, more common, and it's certainly how we started doing wine dinners. And I think what has surprised me is that when you join a wine association or a wine club, the average membership time is 3 to 5 years. We've been going now for 12 years and we've still got members who've been coming for that entire time. In fact, quite a lot of them have been coming for that entire decade or more. And so I recently ran a wine dinner in Sydney back in April with Pizzini Wines from the King Valley in Victoria. And I was working with Natalie Pizzini and we've been working together for 10 years. And her last Sydney event with me, we'd worked out, was about 8 or 9 years previously. So she thought she'd do a show of hands, who in the room was at that original dinner that she'd done in Sydney 8 or 9 years previously. And 20 out of the 60 people in the room put their hand up. So she couldn't believe that either. And that's what's really surprised me, that we haven't just created a series of wine dinners. We've created a community that people feel safe in and want to be part of.
I guess you can work out what I'm going to ask. Is it the wine, or is it, or is it the conversation and the connection? Is that what you've created there?
I think it's the beauty of both. I think that we've got, this great natural social cohesion product that wine is, and then we put that into a really safe and welcoming space, which is exclusively for women. And, there's not something special about spaces that are for one gender or the other, but what it does do is it makes the conversation different, and we all know this. So if you're in a room just with blokes, or if you're in a room just with women, it doesn't matter what the topic is, the conversation's different, the body language is different, what's shared is different, it's just different. And so we're not saying it's better or worse that we're an all-women wine club. We're just saying it's different, and the conversations we have are different, and the way people interact in that space with that wine is different. And so there's a real, I think for a lot of women, safety in being able to say, to ask, to talk, to chat about wine in a way that they might not have felt traditionally in mixed company. And so you've got all of that wine stuff, but then you've just got a really good time as well, Chris. We put on a great show and we give everyone a really great time. And I think that people, really enjoy doing that. And we also don't overdo it. So we visit a city 2 to 3 times a year maximum. So, people are coming once every 4 to 6 months, and that's great. That's just the right amount where we're not, overexposing ourselves or trying to do too much.
I always love having people on the podcast and talking to them a little bit, and they've moved here from somewhere else but spent a couple of decades here. If you had a magic wand, or you're able in our part of the world, what are some of the things you think we could do in this area, whether they're the councils or whether they're the state government or whether they're the communities at large, that would enhance people's lives and improve people's lives? And remembering we've just had our floods and our fires and COVID, but sitting back and now with a couple of decades of seeing how we work here, what would you do? What would you suggest we change? In
this region in particular? For me, I would say more in real life experiences at a community level. So I think that, doing a lot of the travelling that I do with my business into wine regions across the world, I see a lot of annual, seasonal community events that everybody's involved in. And I think that those are structured into everybody's diary, into everybody's life. It's just who they are. It's something they can all participate in. And I don't think that we have a lot of that here. We have festivals, we have pop-up events, but we don't have seasonal, annual, community-driven things that bring us all together in a way that's just predictable, that you don't have to think about, that just is part of living. And I think I envy that about some of those European and South American countries. It's just built into their everyday. Why don't you
think it's a really interesting point? And when you visit those and when you travel and you're lucky enough to check into a town and someone says to you the festival's on for the next couple, you go, I can't believe I'm that lucky.
Exactly.
And whatever. But why don't, that's a very interesting point. Why don't we have those, do you think?
I don't know necessarily why. I think that, again, maybe the transience of our population makes that particularly difficult here. I know that in some other regions of Australia, particularly agricultural ones, there are quite a few of those sorts of festivals.
They've got their shows and their annual this and their annual that.
Yeah, so perhaps the transience of our population and the tourist focus that we have, perhaps there's been an emphasis on tourism rather than locals for too long as well.
Yeah.
But I think that we just need to start them. We just need to get them going. And I think that, it's a very, very old region in terms of our wonderful Indigenous population, but it's still fairly new in terms of most of us who live here and the culture that's popped up here. And so I think we have a real potential and a real opportunity to try and incorporate some very regular community-driven things. Yeah, and I love that some of the festivals that we have been going for a long time, but they are certainly quite niche and specific in their topic areas. And I'm very much talking about things that bring everybody in together. Yeah,
I've seen a couple of those, the food fair that's on in Bangalore, where everyone, all the different generations are there, and all
sample festival. Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah,
in August? It's not.
Yeah, first weekend of September.
Yeah,
first Saturday of September.
I look there at the different generations, and everyone has got a smile on their dial. That's a great festival, and there's a shout out to them. They do very well. Like a lot of the other events, they survived COVID and popped out the other end. Before I run out of time, I'm always interested in asking people, Jane, their favourite places in our part of the world. Where do you take visitors, and where's your favourite spots in the Northern Rivers?
Well, I have to put a plug for the Eltham pub, of course.
Yes,
you know,
of course.
so
Yeah. You have already, by the way.
Yeah. And well, you know, this farmer I married, he's got a job as well. We can't sadly live off the farm anymore these days, but. It was his great, I think I've said enough greats there, Chris, grandfather who actually built the Eltham pub. So we do have a very
You're
sentimental...
royalty out in Eltham then.
You would think so, but no. So we've got a great sentimental attachment there as well. It's wonderful to see a whole new life being breathed into that place over the last few years. It's been really exciting to watch it. And look, the other place that I really like to take people is actually just, it's not as cool as Byron, but it should be, is Lennox Head. I just love it down there. And I think that it's still quiet enough that you can really kind of relax into a whole Sunday afternoon or a whole Saturday at the beach. You can still wander straight off the beach, having a beautiful swim to, you know, into something that's gorgeous where you can get a glass of wine and something wonderful to eat. And that's becoming increasingly hard to do here in Byron, I think. So I really love taking people who come to visit me down to Lennox. You know, you might see a Hemsworth playing cricket as well. That's always a draw card, isn't it? But I think it's still got some good old school vibes down there. And I don't know why. I mean, property's taken off down there, but I still think it's very quiet.
I think people who haven't visited here for a long time would be surprised. There's lots of cool places here now, right up the northern part of the Shire, right down to the southern part of the Ballina Shire. There's so many lovely little places, and I think what Byron Bay has done in recent years is push a lot of people to discover the little villages and towns.
Yeah.
And they've all got wonderful food now, including plenty of sourdough bread and good coffee and great food in general. And when Byron does get really busy, it's great. People can go down to those parts of the world and enjoy themselves.
Absolutely.
Jane, we really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for being part of the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a joy.